This is footage of Israel Rincon, a former Sinaloa member, moments before facing El Chapo's wrath for switching sides. His terrified eyes pointed straight at the camera placed on a tripod that's about to record his torture. Here are some of El Chapo's most brutal torture methods. December 2008, a remote mountain hideout in Sinaloa. A man kneels before El Chapo, his face bloodied and swollen. This is Israel Rincon Martinez, aka El Guacho, and just hours earlier, he was a respected member of the Sinaloa cartel. But now he's a traitor who's about to face the most dangerous man in Mexico. Now during this time, El Chapo was at war with the BLO, and that's when Rincon committed the ultimate betrayal by switching sides. As far as Chapo cared, disloyalty was a sin that needed to be paid in screams and severed flesh. What happened next would later be described in court testimony as a standard procedure in the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo directs these tortures himself, sitting close enough to see Rincon's face twist in pain. Now what's even worse is who's standing next to Big Papa here, his oldest sons, Ivan and Jesus. And they watch on without emotion as their father goes to work, because this is a lesson in how the family handles traitors. The torture starts in a simple way. Rincon is tied to a metal chair in the middle of a bare room with nothing but concrete walls surrounding him. A cartel member walks up with jumper cables hooked up to a car battery. And when El Chapo nods, the man attaches the clips to Rincon's body. And as soon as that electricity hits him, you can hear the screams a mile away. Between the shocks, El Chapo would ask him questions about the betrayal, to which Rincon had no choice but to answer. When this guy just couldn't take the pain any longer, he passed out. Now, most interrogations might end here, but instead of calling off his men, El Chapo just nodded to the doctor in the corner there. The doctor steps forward with a syringe filled with adrenaline. He drives that straight into Rincon's chest, forcing his heart to keep pumping. And that's when this victim realized the nightmare was just getting started. This cycle went on for hours. Chapo's men would shock him until he couldn't take it anymore. Then a doctor would bring him back. More questions, more electricity, more screaming. This torture video was uploaded for anyone considering betrayal. And as for Rincon himself, his body, or whatever remained of it, was never recovered. In the cartel world, reputation is everything. And through displays of extreme violence, El Chapo made sure his reputation was built on pure fear. But a doctor's revival is just one method in El Chapo's brutal arsenal. And as his empire grew, so did his creativity for inflicting pain. January 2017, a secret location used by Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons. Inside this compound, hungry tigers pace in their cages, waiting for their next meal. And they won't have to wait long. An offering is about to arrive. By now, El Chapo's been arrested. His brutal legacy continued through his children. And while he sat in prison, they made Daddy proud, escalating violence to an entirely new and far scarier height.
They have fed some of their victims, dead and alive, to tigers belonging to the Chapitos.
Ivan and Alfredo Guzman, two of El Chapo's oldest sons, developed a particular affinity for exotic pets, especially after it became clear that their father was no longer there to protect them. But these weren't your run-of-the-mill status symbols, they were weapons too.
Is this like a common thing for narcos?
Sí, es muy normal porque pues es una manera de mostrarle tu integridad.
The practice is as simple as it is savage. You capture enemies, CIs, or just about anyone who crosses you, and you bring them onto the property where tigers are kept. Sometimes you're already dead, but sometimes you're not. The DEA would later uncover evidence that Los Chapitos would sometimes use these executions to test the potency of their drugs.
In another instance, those defendants experimented on a woman they had been ordered to shoot. Instead, they injected her repeatedly with fentanyl until she overdosed and died.
Victims are forced to ingest drugs, and their reactions and time of death are carefully noted. They were then locked in a cage with these tigers. The method served multiple purposes. It provided them with a hassle-free disposal of any evidence, intimidation, and, above all, a perverse form of some cartel entertainment. DEA Chief Ann Milgram would later summarize the operation.
Death and destruction are central to their whole operation. The Sinaloa cartel's a network that fuels violence and death on both sides of the border.
Los Chapitos inherited both their father's business and his taste for cruelty. Now, while most children might try to rebel against their parents, the Guzman boys embraced their legacy. They even pushed it into darker extremes. Now, all that's pretty shocking, but it's not the most elaborate torture technique in the Sinaloa cartel playbook. 2006. Another mountain hideout in Sierra Madre. A rival cartel member covered in burns from cigarette lighters and clothing irons, barely recognizable, is dragged before El Chapo. Isaias Valdez-Rios, aka Memin, one of El Chapo's most trusted guards, would later testify in court about what happened next. A testimony so graphic that the judge would have to interrupt, saying,
"Could we have less narrative, please?"
El Chapo places this prisoner in a chicken coop outside the mountain air where temperatures are dropping near freezing at night. Now there, the man would remain for days until even Chapo's men started to see it as overkill.
"We told Mr. Joaquin that this man had a bad odor because he was decomposing in a way."
But that did little to persuade him to put a stop to the cruelty. Every few hours, El Chapo would visit his captive, asking questions about rival operations. And whenever the answers weren't to his liking, which they never were, El Chapo would shoot this guy, carefully aiming as not to kill him and prolong the suffering as much as possible. After days of this treatment, with the man's wounds festering and his body failing, El Chapo decided to end him. But it keeps going, because this is when Memin was asked to do the unthinkable. El Chapo hands him a shovel, and Memin understands the command immediately. He had to bury the man while he was still alive. Refusal was not an option, because hesitation alone could put him in the same hole. So Memin started scooping earth under the watchful eye of El Chapo. Once that hole was deep enough, they dragged that barely conscious man to the edge. The prisoner, somehow still alive despite days of torture, could do little except look up helplessly as the first shovels of dirt covered his face. The man died slowly under the dirt, unable to breathe as El Chapo stood watching until it was all over. Now, for his participation in this and countless other acts of cruelty, Memin received roughly $175 a week. He slept on the ground, was called on 24/7, and witnessed horrors that would stay with him long after he turned state's witness.
"Sometimes I hardly ate. Even when Mr. Joaquin would rest in his cabin, I would try to sort of rest. But I'd have a small radio with me and he'd say, 'Memin, what did so-and-so say? Memin, say this to so-and-so.'"
El Chapo's need to control extended to every aspect of his operation, including how his enemies died. But for some victims, death was just the beginning of their horror. January 2010, Los Mochis, Mexico. City Hall workers arrived to find a plastic bag left at the entrance. Inside, a sickening display. A football covered with human skin, a face that's still recognizable, stitches holding it in place. Days earlier, 36-year-old Hugo Hernandez had been kidnapped from neighboring Sonora State. He had connections to the Juarez cartel, which made him an enemy of El Chapo. But what happens between his abduction and the discovery of that horrific scene shows a level of calculated sadism that really shocked even the most hardened investigators. Hernandez wasn't just killed here, he was systematically disassembled as if he were a toy. His torso was found in a plastic container in one location, with his arms, legs, and skull discovered in another box somewhere else. But nothing compared to what was left at City Hall. Hernandez's face had been carefully removed from his skull, and then stitched onto a football. Accompanying the grotesque trophy was a note with a simple message.
Happy New Year, because this'll be our last.
Reports later indicated that El Chapo had personally overseen that atrocity, eating popcorn, meticulously removing his face, and applying the stitches himself. That message was clear. Cross the Sinaloa cartel, and may whatever God you believe in have mercy on your soul. But as personal as these killings could be, sometimes El Chapo preferred to hand off the worst of it to his specialists. 2010, we're at a small church in Mexico where a wedding ceremony's underway. The bride and groom exchange their vows, surrounded by family and friends. It's got to be the happiest day of their lives. And then, Jesus Christ, Jose Antonio Jaguar Marufo, El Chapo's most trusted sicario, arrives with his team. Guests are screaming as armed men storm the church. They're not here for money, and they're not here for drugs. They've come for the groom. In front of his new bride and their family, the groom is seized, along with his brother and uncle. Then they're dragged from the church and thrown into vehicles. While the reason behind that wedding crash remains unclear to this day, it is pretty clear that it was kinda personal. El Chapo sanctioned the kidnapping himself, making sure that the message wasn't just sent to his target, but to all who witnessed this too. For El Jaguar, this was just another day at his job. As El Chapo's preferred enforcer, he had developed a specialization in torture and public displays of violence. This guy took pride in his work, signing his murders like an artist. This guy had transformed his house into a facility dedicated to suffering, and former associates later described its most notorious feature in court testimony, calling it a soundproof murder room.
He took me once to a house where the floor was just white, tiled. That's where he took people.
And it's this attention to detail that made him invaluable to El Chapo. While the cartel leader could be impulsive in his violence, El Jaguar brought planning and precision to the task of breaking human beings. Bodies of his victims would appear throughout Sinaloa, often with banners attached naming their supposed crimes against the cartel. And as brutal as El Chapo could be personally, his willingness to employ people like El Jaguar just show his businessman's approach to even the darkest aspects of his operation. But sometimes, even El Chapo wanted to handle things all by himself. 2007, the deep mountains of Sinaloa. Two men kneel before El Chapo, members of Los Zetas, a rival ex-military faction. Their training made them formidable opponents, but now they're just two more bodies for El Chapo to break. These men had been captured and delivered to El Chapo as a gift from his hitmen. And what followed proved that despite his position at the top of a massive criminal enterprise, El Chapo still took a hands-on approach to punishment. According to Isaias Valdez-Rios, the same guy who was burying El Chapo's rivals in the previous one, El Chapo would personally beat both men for hours with a heavy wooden branch, as well as with the butt of his rifle.
They were completely like ragdolls. Their bones were totally broken. They couldn't move, and Joaquin was still hitting them with that branch and his weapon too.
While the beatings continued, El Chapo ordered preparations for the men's execution. His hitmen dug a pit and filled it with wood, creating a massive pyre. Then the unconscious Zetas members were tied to the back of ATVs and dragged to the edge of that fire pit. Despite their condition, both these guys were still conscious in their final moments. Holding his gold-plated AK-47, El Chapo steps up to the first guy. He puts the barrel against the guy's head and screams obscenities before finally pulling the trigger. The second man meets the same fate moments later, and both these bodies are thrown into the fire. The personal involvement in violence separated El Chapo from many other cartel leaders who preferred to kind of maintain a distance from the bloodshed, but as hands-on as El Chapo could be, his sons would literally take the personal approach to violence even further. 2017, a secret location in Sinaloa. Two Mexican federal police officers have been captured by El Chapo's eldest sons. At this point, El Chapo's awaiting extradition to the U.S., and his sons have divided up his empire, determined to prove that they can be just as ruthless as their father. The officers are bound to chairs, and it gets disturbing. In a detailed testimony, prosecutors talk about the horror these men endured.
For approximately 2 hours, they tortured victim 5 by inserting a corkscrew into victim 5's muscles, ripping it out of his muscles, and placing hot chiles in his open wounds and nose, before being shot dead by Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar.
That type of torture is pretty twisted. Those corkscrews aren't going to kill a person, but it's going to create excruciating pain for prolonged periods of time. What makes it worse is that it seemed more like a practice technique, which can only mean that they perfected it over time. Now, after hours of this kind of treatment, Ivan Guzman personally executes the officer with a gunshot to the head. The second one receives a similar treatment. Both the bodies are then dumped near a motel off a highway. Court testimony shows Los Chapitos had developed their own preferred methods of torture, which included electrocution and waterboarding, and they wouldn't do it just to their enemies, but anybody who crossed them. People like police officers, debtors, innocent family members of their targets, random bystanders, didn't matter. And in some ways, they had surpassed their father in cruelty. El Chapo's violence was often calculated for effect, but it looks like Los Chapitos seem to take pleasure in the suffering they cause. It's pretty obvious that Chapitos learned well from their father, but these boys aren't the only cruel ones in El Chapo's world. The apple didn't fall far from the tree, and El Chapo's orchard grew in hostile soil, and his enemies' brutality only inspired him to push the boundaries of cruelty even further. It's 1978, Guadalajara, Mexico. Hector El Guero Palma Salazar, one of El Chapo's closest allies, is arrested and imprisoned in the U.S. Now, for most criminals, prison means protection for their families on the outside. But for cartel members, it means vulnerability. You see, Palma worked his way up through the Guadalajara cartel with El Chapo right by his side, earning his nickname El Guero, meaning the blonde one, thanks to his light complexion and reddish hair. His imprisonment created an opportunity that his enemies were quick to jump on. While Palma sat behind bars, unable to protect his family, a Venezuelan drug trafficker named Rafael Clavel Moreno saw this opportunity. Working for the rival Tijuana cartel, Clavel devises a plan more brutal than just simply killing Palma. He's going to destroy everything Palma loved. So Clavel would seduce Palma's wife, Guadalupe Lea Serrano. After gaining her trust, he convinced her to withdraw $7 million from Palma's accounts. For Guadalupe, this was the beginning of a new life. But for Clavel, it was just the first step. Because once he had that money, he decided Guadalupe was no longer useful. And what this sick bastard did demonstrates the depths of cartel cruelty. Clavel killed Guadalupe. He wants Palma to feel pain beyond imagination, so he decides to preserve her head in a cooler packed with ice. He then sends that cooler to Palma in prison with a note mocking Palma's powerlessness. And Clavel was just getting started. This guy had access to Palma's 2 young children, a 5-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. The children are kidnapped and taken all the way to the Venezuela-Colombian border. There, at a bridge, Clavel threw both of them to their deaths. Their bodies recovered days later. When El Chapo found out about what happened to his friend's family, he took note. The lesson was clear. Family was both a strength and a vulnerability in the cartel world. So El Chapo would later adopt similar tactics against his enemies, ensuring that no one close to his targets was safe from his vengeance. From that point on, the cycle of revenge between cartels escalated. The message again clear: there are no innocent bystanders, no protected family members, and no limits to the cruelty that could be inflicted. 2011. A secluded warehouse on the outskirts of Culiacan, Mexico. Inside, large plastic barrels line the walls. It'd be better if it was filled with chemicals for drug production, but it's something far more horrifying. This is the place where some of El Chapo's enemies simply disappear. Amongst the most horrifying methods in the Sinaloa cartel's arsenal is the acid bath, a technique that helps them dispose of bodies in a way that's almost untraceable. Again, the process is simple. Victims are dumped in barrels with sulfuric acid or caustic soda, which are chemicals that can dissolve human tissue within hours. Sometimes victims would watch others get dissolved before them, knowing their own fate is sealed. Oh, the chemicals burn instantly upon contact, causing the most unimaginable pain, before death finally pulls you in. Now for El Chapo, he had a lot of use for acid baths. First off, they would take care of the bodies in a relatively short amount of time, leaving no evidence for authorities to lean on. Second, it was a powerful message to his enemies. And third, they created a legend of horror that spread through whispered stories, solidifying the cartel's fearsome reputation. Some of El Chapo's members testified that he kept victims alive during the initial stages, and then lowered them gradually into the acid feet first. The victim would remain conscious as their lower extremities dissolved, experiencing a pain so intense that you're begging for a bullet long before the acid reached any vital organ. But while this sick, twisted day spa eliminated physical evidence, El Chapo sometimes wanted proof of his work to share with others. And his next method provided exactly that. 2009. In a dimly lit room somewhere in Sinaloa, Mexico, a camera set up on a tripod pointed to a man tied to a chair. In the digital age, El Chapo understood the power of visual evidence, so video executions became a standard practice, as well as proof for psychological warfare. And these killings weren't quick either. The victim would be forced to confess their crimes against the Sinaloa cartel. Then they were handed scripts to ensure that the victim spoke of El Chapo's messages about loyalty and consequences of betrayal loud and clear. But what made these videos particularly effective was their distribution. Now, this was initially shared amongst the cartel as proof of completed assignments. But, they made their way to social media. And the knowledge that one's death might become viral content just added another layer of psychological torture for victims. El Chapo's video executions typically followed a standard format. The victim, already beaten and tortured, would state their name and alleged crimes. They would acknowledge the justice of their punishment and warn others against making similar mistakes. Then the execution would proceed, sometimes with a bullet, and sometimes with something slower and much more visually dramatic. Maybe the most disturbing thing would be how these videos normalized extreme violence. Because what would have once been unthinkable became routine viewing for cartel members. And the barriers between witnessing, participating in, and eventually leading such executions gradually eroded, creating new generations of killers desensitized to ever-increasing levels of brutality. And as technology evolves, so do these videos. What began with grainy footage shot on handheld cameras eventually became this high-definition production with multiple angles and even some form of basic editing. The documentation of death had become another business process within the cartel's operations. Systematic, standardized, and chillingly professional.